Well, welcome everyone. My name is Tamaya Cox-Duray, and I am the new Executive Director for the ACLU of Oklahoma. I've been on the job since November now, so it is really great to be here and to be really talking about a tactic that we use that that's really dear and near to my heart, which is session and policy and all things regarding how we can move Oklahoma forward through the policy part. We know that in the midst of COVID, that we're unable to be together face to face as we would hope to be for this legislative preview. So we know we were losing some of that, the comfortability of being together and seeing each other and talking. So I definitely want to make this as interactive as possible. So in the chat, would love to, if you don't mind, just quickly introducing who you are and your pronouns, as well as where you're from, what city you're in. We know that the ACLU has supporters from all across the state, and we just like to see where you all are. So as we're talking, go ahead and do that, and really good, great to have you all here this evening with us. When I first started with the ACLU, I was actually an intern in law school. I was first year new to what law was, and I was the person who did not have lawyers in our family. So I felt very behind because a lot of the people in my class, their fathers and their mothers were attorneys. And so because of that, they already had internships lined up, but I didn't. So the first semester of my first year, we had a career fair, a pro bono career fair, and the ACLU had a booth there. I had no idea what the ACLU was. I could not tell you what it stood for. But I did know that Bill O'Reilly hated the ACLU. Talked about his show, and I'm dating myself, talked about his show on his show about the ACLU all the time. And for me, because of that, I knew this was an organization I needed to be a part of. And so from there, I started interning, a very small group. At the time, there's only 3 other staff people there, started interning and just recognized the importance of the ACLU in Oklahoma. An organization that was defending the civil liberties of all Oklahomans, really focusing on race equity, LGBTQ2S, and as well as reproductive health care. And it was no surprise that I ended up being there for actually 7 years later, from law school to passing the bar to being a legislative counsel. It was been a time of my life. But then I left, right? I decided I needed something a little more easier. I just needed something easier. And I went to go work for Planned Parenthood doing lobbying. So I'm your attorney who's never in the courtroom. And so I've been doing legislative and policy work my entire career. But then back a few months ago, when the great leadership of Ryan Kiesel decided to move on, it felt like it was my time. It was my time to come back home. And it was really an opportunity for me to, all the skills that I had honed in from Planned Parenthood to everything else I was doing. It was time to come back home. So grateful to the board and for the amazing staff for giving me this opportunity to now lead. So I know there's a story in there from intern to executive director, but I'm so happy to be here and really, so glad to be part of the strategy of ways that we can ensure that civil liberties belongs to all of us. And I come from a really repro rights and repro justice mindset. And one of the big tenets of that is that, of course, everyone has reproductive rights, but they don't necessarily have access to those rights. And that's really how I see the ACLU really fitting into the movement work here in Oklahoma, is ensuring that all Oklahomans have access to the civil liberties that they are guaranteed by our Constitution. So with that, I'm really excited to talk about, to be a part of this conversation about what's happening under the dome at the Capitol. We've heard a lot of stories. You may have seen the news about some of the issues that have already been discussed. I think it's important to know we're only on day 4 of session, but we're really excited to know that it is very possible that we could see some great gains and some great wins, but we also might have some losses. And And how do we make sure that the community is aware of what's going on under the dome, I think is one of our biggest assets and biggest things that we can do as an organization. So that's really what today is about, this evening is about. So again, we can't be as interactive as we'd like, but what we can do is make sure that we're answering the questions that you may have. We do not ever want to believe that we know all the answers, but we also know that navigating the legislature is not easy. And sometimes it feels like it's designed to be difficult. But we want to make sure that we are as transparent with you, and so you all know what is going on there. So again, feel free to ask any question you have. However, because of just the setup that we have, if you will look on, for some of us, it may be on the bottom of our screen. For others, it may be on the top, but there's a Q&A button. And in the Q&A button is where you can chat or you can ask your questions. So while we will not be answering questions until the end of our program, please know that if you have questions throughout, please get them there. Also know that we are doing a live transcript, and as probably no surprise that the spellings may not always be accurate. So if you are looking for a legislator and you're using the live transcript to make sure you catch that name, just be aware that that may not be the most accurate spelling of the name of the legislator. But we can make sure that we get that information to you. And lastly, as we said earlier, we're really excited about our session playlist. So again, an opportunity to enjoy the next 4 months with us, how we're going to get through it. We think this playlist is going to help us get through those difficulties. But again, we really hope that we see some wins this session. I'm gonna pass it over to Nicole Mcafee, who's our Director of Advocacy, and who owns all of our policy work. But just as far as the Oklahoma legislature, just so you all know that we are a nonpartisan organization. So we do not care about the R or the D behind a legislator's name. We just want to make sure that they are expanding access and expanding civil liberties. That's all we care about. But with that, we also recognize that this could be a very difficult session because elections have consequences. So we always want to keep in mind that we want to expect wins, but we also know that it could be an uphill battle. So we are really relying on you all to help us, with our legislative priorities. That I'm sure at the end we'll have an ask of getting involved in our rapid response teams. Some of our legislative advocacy week that will be happening later on this month. We really want you involved. Legislators need to hear from you. And sometimes that's difficult because you say, but I have Senator so-and-so and he never listens to me. That's okay, but that doesn't mean that your voice shouldn't be heard. And if you get anything out of today, we want you to know that your voice is just as important as anyone else's, and you deserve and have that right for your voice to be heard, and the legislature and that legislator should be hearing it as often as possible. So with that said, again, so glad that you joined us for this evening, and I'm going to turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, y'all. Nicole Mcafee, she, her, hers. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy for the ACLU of Oklahoma. And that means that between February and May, I spend a lot of my waking and some of my sleeping hours thinking about what's going on in session, how we can stop the things that could cause harm, and where we can expand and advance on civil rights and civil liberties. I'm going to try to talk about some big thematic buckets of what we're seeing in the legislature this year. Again, feel free to use the Q&A feature as I'm talking, as you have questions now, at the end, and as soon as I sort of wrap this, we will then go through those questions and try to get you as many answers as we possibly can. I'll note that this session, this first week, has felt like the longest first week of legislative session in the past few years, at least. It's a tough session, and I think that COVID-19 certainly plays a role in that, and I don't want to downplay sort of the new obstacles that creates in trying to engage with and interact with legislators. I also think that we've seen sort of in the partisan shift in the Oklahoma State House, a gain of 5 seats by Republicans. a feeling from leadership when we saw this in Governor Stitt's State of the State address, that is a mandate largely to attack people's rights and liberties, to move a lot of partisan legislation that causes a lot of harm. So I think as we think about this session, we're thinking about where we can make some gains, but we're also trying to look at sort of just the really large volume of bad bills that are attacking rights and liberties, and trying to prioritize capacity based on what has the potential to do the most harm. So I think I'll start with a little bit of the good, because I think we could always use some good news. We've seen some of the continuing trend of folks who really have started to engage with the carceral reform space. So legislators who got really interested either during or after State Question 780 in 2016, and have kind of continued that trend of trying to figure out where we can reduce the prison population, how we can remove sort of treatment and substance use out of the criminal legal space, and also where we can address racial disparities that exist because of systemic racism in the criminal legal system, and because of bias in policing. And so we've got a lot of positive bills there. Some bills by folks like Representative Bush dealing with harm reduction, bills from Representative Blancett that deal with the pretrial system and pretrial release. We've got a bill from Representative Frick's, House Bill 2320, which is an effort that's been close sort of to the ACLU of Oklahoma's work for the last several years, focusing on bifurcation of juries and making sure that the juries are provided with a full range of sentencing instructions, making that a more viable option for folks sort of facing a potential trial. I think that we also see some really good legislation aimed at expanding voting access. There are a lot of folks who really want to see us sort of further scale back felony disenfranchisement in Oklahoma. Representative Turner has legislation that would ensure people held in jails pre-trial could receive their ballot so that they aren't disenfranchised just because they can't afford to be released on bail. There is legislation from Senator Kurt that would really put some hard timelines to make advancements in our online registration system happen. And I'm always really enthused just by the conversations that happen around that legislation and around the number of people that sort of yield that legislation. I think oftentimes when we see work like that, we see the work of ACLU of Oklahoma members who have really been engaged and who have reached out again and again to those elected officials in order to make these priorities. We also have sort of the unfortunate task of engaging in fights on a lot of different fronts. There are a lot of organizations in Oklahoma who sort of fight in one space, and we do our best to connect and collaborate everywhere we can, but we know that we are facing a lot of different civil rights and civil liberties issues this year. As much as we are seeing some good sort of criminal justice reform, there are a lot of bills that would reinforce the current carceral system, including 3 bills in the Senate, all set to be heard on Monday in the Senate Public Safety Committee that would roll back parts of State Question 780. So not only sort of bills that would reinforce the system, but also bills that would roll back reforms that have done a lot of good and done a lot to reduce the number of folks in Oklahoma prisons just in the last few years. I'll note too that part of sort of this concern around the criminal legal reform space and the bill trends we're seeing there is the expansion of committees covering those bills in the Oklahoma House. So previously, most of those bills went through the Judiciary Committee. This year, the Judiciary Committee has been split into 2 again in the House. So there's a civil and a criminal side, and the criminal side is chaired by Representative Randy Worthen, who's a former prosecutor who has not been very open to reform during his tenure in the legislature. There is a Criminal Justice and Corrections Committee that is chaired by Representative Humphrey, who's a former ODOC employee. That body is largely made up of folks with a background in law enforcement. And then there's also a Public Safety Committee that is chaired by a former US Marshal. So the sort of decision-making folks in those bodies are people who are less open to reform in sort of the carceral space. We're also seeing a concerning trend regarding attacks on the initiative petition process. We know that the right to the initiative petition is one of the first things granted to Oklahomans in our state constitution. And you would not guess that if you read through legislation this year, because there are a number of different ways folks are trying to attack that, everything from making it harder for grassroots initiatives to collect the necessary amount of signatures to raising the vote threshold to 60% or above. So creating this really high threshold in order for folks to pass initiative petitions. And we know how valuable the initiative petition process can be. It gave us State Question 780 and State Question 788. It gave us Medicaid expansion this last year. We've seen folks on the ground do so much. And the fact that legislators feel that that's sort of a threat to their agendas, I think is a space that we really need to engage with them on how important it is for us as constituents to be able to add our voice to the policy process and for that not to be made more difficult. Another trend we are seeing is a large number of bills that in some way, shape, or form deal with the idea of rioting. Many are within the incitement to riot statute. And what those bills would do is they're largely created to target Black Lives Matter protesters and other folks who are working in police accountability. The legislation does everything from grant people who would drive into a protest that was happening in a street without a permit sort of more protection from accountability, to increasing the ways in which prosecutors could charge a group of protesters that they already sort of disproportionately charge with crimes after a protest. We this week sort of saw the first round of attacks from the really large volume of bills attacking access to abortion care in Oklahoma. And there are 5 of those in the Senate that are currently moving. We additionally saw an increase in bills from the last several years attacking the LGBTQ2S+ community filed this year, especially bills targeting trans youth. In the Senate, there are 2 bills that, if passed, would try to ban or criminalize providers for providing gender-affirming care, as well as bills that attack trans youth ability to participate in school sports. There sort of is no shortage of other issues. We've got, if you look at my legislative tracking list, it is somewhere too close to 500 bills for my liking. And we are doing our best every day to make sure folks in our rapid response team know where we should call and put pressure to try to communicate that out on social media. I think it's going to be a sprint and a marathon that we are going to be running full speed ahead through the end of May to try to fight back against a lot of these attacks and hopefully to see some of these really positive opportunities advance as well. I'll make a plug that ACLU is doing some really incredible series of trainings. Next week, they are leading a few around how to tell your story, how to engage with elected officials and let them know why you care about an issue as you're trying to move them to action. And also would love to see folks sign up for the end of February. We are doing a virtual advocacy week, a way for as many people as possible to safely participate in that kind of final deadline week push. So that first deadline of the session, when bills either make it or they don't, and really try to let our elected officials and legislative leadership know what is important to us. And Cassidy has dropped the link for that over in the chat. It is on the ACLU of Oklahoma website. And Cassidy often pushes those links out on social media as well to try to make sure you have as many opportunities as possible to see what's going on. And I could talk all day about bills. I'm sure my partner would tell you if you ask me a question, I can go on forever about any of them. But I would love to hear just from y'all. Please drop questions in the Q&A. What you're concerned about. Are there bills or bill themes in particular that you're worried about? More information about plugging in. I would love to hear from you. I see we've got a question from Veronica Leisure about listing bills by bill number. We are working on sort of the most effective way to share out a list right now that happens at a pace that both we can keep it up and provide updates for folks, and is a reasonable number of bills that attacks what's most important. So hopefully in the next week, we will have some form of front-facing list of what we're keeping an eye on. And we'll just make the plug too that I always welcome people reaching out with more bills. There are so many things moving through session that we do a lot of work to try to create sort of the perfect list and make sure everything is included and that we don't miss things. And it is impossible not to miss things. I can tell you that. And I am always grateful when someone says, hey, want to make sure this is on your radar. If it's already on our radar, it doesn't hurt. And if it's not, I am glad to know about it. So I really appreciate everyone who sort of engages in that part of the advocacy too, to make sure that we're aware of what's going on. There is a question about how much of our effort is spent on reproductive freedom. I think that like there aren't sort of, division of 10% of our time is spent on this and this. A lot of that kind of division of labor and capacity depends on what is moving and what causes harm. We definitely do a lot of work sort of in the reproductive rights space of lifting up work of our partners. I think that one of the strengths in Oklahoma is that when we have people who work solely on that issue, that we can be there for support and we push out our own initiatives too, but often where we can lift up the work other folks are doing when they are dedicated to that issue full time, we try our best to do that. And so work a lot with Oklahoma Call for Reproductive Justice and Planned Parenthood Great Plains and their sort of advocacy wing in making sure that we're all collectively plugged into that effort. And I think with more bills this year, it is definitely something that we will be looking at sort of spending more of our time on, but that it also is something that doesn't sort of, that it touches a lot of our work. I think that we think of sort of just the bills attacking access to abortion care as reproductive justice bills, but there are many bills in sort of the criminal legal reform space that deal with reproductive freedom as well. So it is definitely something that is very much on our radar and very much part of my day-to-day work. We have a question about what were some of the problems with the Yes on 805 campaign and what can we do to avoid that kind of setback again. For most of you, I'm sure you were very familiar with State Question 805, which was on the ballot in November, and unfortunately, which we fell short on votes to pass. State Question 805 would have addressed the use of repeat sentence penalties and ended them for statutorily nonviolent crimes. I think that there's always a lot to dig into here on where we could have done things differently and what we know now. But I think a few things that it's worth uplifting is that one, we have to have a deeper conversation with folks about violence and nonviolence and how that dichotomy often doesn't serve us in talking about carceral reform, that so much of that election got caught up on what was or was not violent, and that at the end of the day, the violent crimes list is not the differentiation between what is and what isn't violent in Oklahoma. There are things on that list that we don't normally associate with violence. There are things not on the list that maybe we do. There are different levels of harm that can and can't occur in sort of, any level of criminalized activity. But at the end of the day, what the violent crimes list does is it's actually just a list that subjects certain charges to tough on crime era policies. So mandatory minimums, harder access to receiving parole or commutation, things that we know are sort of not only bad policy when it comes to recidivism, but also further disparities for incarceration of Black and Indigenous Oklahomans. So I think digging into that conversation and giving folks a clear idea of why we've got to move beyond a discussion of violence and why instead we need to talk about harm and repairing harm and a system sort of that responds to harm rather than a system that responds with punishment is sort of a lesson learned there and a next step. The other thing I'll note is that that policy is being revisited, though, in sort of a slimmed down way through legislation. So it is Senate Bill 704. We're early enough in session that I don't have all of the bill numbers fully locked into my head yet, but Senate Bill 704 addresses the use of repeat sentence penalties. It has more carve-outs than were on the state question, but it would still be a step in providing relief for a lot of folks, disproportionately Black and Indigenous Oklahomans, who are subjected to those repeat sentence penalties because of a system that creates more scenarios where folks re-encounter law enforcement and re-encounter the carceral system. There is a question about the ACLU and concern to pseudoscience bills. One of them being named as the Sasquatch hunting season, and I know that that's gotten a lot of press. I'll note there that that is a piece of legislation that I think is largely a tourism bill for that legislator's district, that folks do what they can to get people to pay attention, to invest in their part of the state, and that's especially true for rural legislators, that we are always concerned about things that maybe put in statute non-science, especially concerned about where that applies to access to abortion care, to the carceral system. But I think that sort of those fall into like a concern within other civil rights and civil liberties concerns, that as much as I think we all personally care very much about pseudoscience and what's being discussed in the legislature, that just because of capacity, at the end of the day, so much of our focus has to be potential harms and potential opportunities around civil rights and civil liberties. It's a question about which stage can we tell a bill is likely to move forward? Are there any particularly bad bills that we believe may move? I'll note that the legislature is always a bit of a guessing game. We're doing our best based on past experience, based on some gut instinct, based on conversations with people we can have about what will and won't move. The last week of February is the first committee deadline. And so while there are always some exceptions to the rules, for the most part, we will have a clear idea about a much narrower list of bills that's moving at that point. Will still be too big a list of bills, but we'll at least be able to sort of look at trends of what's happening and where we're seeing movement. The other way we really know is through conversations. So would encourage folks, as you're plugged in with us, as you're plugged in with AC and the work that they're doing in trainings, if you have a conversation, feel free to reach back out. We always want to hear what legislators are saying, what they're concerned about, because all of that information sort of helps us decide where and how we can best use our resources. In particularly bad bills, I think that sometimes that list can go on for quite a while. I'm really concerned about the 780 rollback bills in the Senate, just as sort of a harm. Like we have worked so hard and come not nearly far enough in addressing Oklahoma's carceral crisis, and the idea that we may now have to fight sort of the little bit of progress we've made being overturned is something that concerns me a lot. I also know that we have a really robust coalition of folks working on this, but am concerned about the bills targeting trans youth. These are bills that we've seen pop up in other state legislatures around the country. I think it speaks to a broader culture of transphobia in the legislature, and the fact that folks think they can advance these bills sort of for partisan points is really infuriating. I think that we've got a lot of conversations to have and culture change to do, but I worry about those. And then sort of also just the category of bills targeting protesters, that there is just a really large volume of those. It's sort of a new legislative trend that not only are we seeing in Oklahoma, but that we're seeing in states around the country. And I always worry about situations that could put folks pushing for police accountability, and especially Black and Indigenous movement spaces, in harm's way from folks who may either try to attack those protests or with law enforcement. And so those are kind of some of the top trends that I'm trying to keep an eye on. There's a question about model legislation. I'll just say to that, yes, a lot of these bad bills are copy and paste. They're coming from a whole variety of groups, though. It can, like an occasion, you can find online where those came from. But I think less often the sort of exposing where they came from doesn't move folks as much as it does to just engage in the advocacy on trying to kill the bill. And so that is where we focus a lot of our time there. And I think that's all I've got on questions.
I think that's all the questions, Nicole. Could you just talk to us just like briefly about just the process of the bill? Like how does a bill go from being introduced? You know, we saw bills being passed out of committee. Does that mean they're law? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we had thousands of bills filed before session. Monday kicked things off, and this first sort of phase we're in is a lot of committee hearings. So every bill has now been assigned to a different committee in the chamber that it was authored. So House bills are assigned to a committee in the House, Senate bills to a committee in the Senate. In order to become law, a bill has to pass out of the committee and chamber of origin by the chamber deadline, which is the end of February. It then has to pass off the floor of that chamber. It then goes over to the other chamber. So if it's a Senate bill, it goes to the House. If it's a House bill, it goes to the Senate. And it has to pass through a committee in the opposite chamber and then off the floor in the opposite chamber. There are extra steps if amendments were made, if title was off along the way, and then it has to be signed by the governor. So it's not easy for something to become law. Typically, bills will sort of move along with deadlines. So we'll always see sort of a few, usually partisan issues, but also in this case, I think we're seeing sort of like emergency legislation to make the Open Meetings Act virtual again in response to COVID. And so some of those bills will move much more quickly. But otherwise, they kind of make their way through, and we see a smaller and smaller group move each deadline until the end of May. And most of those then aren't officially enacted until November unless they have an emergency clause on them.
So from the advocacy standpoint, it sounds like supporters and advocates have a lot of room to still make their voice be heard. Is that fair? That just because it passed in the Senate, there's still opportunity?
Yeah, there's never anything that should keep you from sharing your opinion. And I'll say that especially even if you think my legislators are good on this issue, both because legislators, I think, always could use some support from their constituents. It can feel lonely sometimes in these fights, and to know that people who voted for them want them to vote the way they're voting is helpful. I think it can create room for critical conversations, but also that even if we don't change folks' mind on the why, sometimes there's enough pressure to make them think twice about how they're going to vote, or to make them walk a vote. They're worried about being on the record. You've created enough pressure that they just don't show up. And that can be helpful too. So I would encourage you, especially at the beginning of session, I like to send a nice email to my state representative and my state senator, letting them know that I will be contacting them throughout the session, like to set that, that standard, and then just regularly check in. There are bills moving constantly, and you can constantly provide input. It can be difficult for them to read all of those bills, and sometimes the only summary they get of a piece of legislation are the few very legal sentences at the top of the bill itself and something they get from a constituent. So I'd encourage folks to always push and to always interject yourself into that conversation with your elected officials.
Thank you. I did see we had one more question, and I know we're near time. I think it was around, should we be worried that Senate Bill 779 around the MABs, or medication abortions, can be used to limit drug access in the state rather than enforcing safety regulation? I'll just real quickly, Nicole, if you don't mind me just taking this, I can tell you that just coming from an organization, coming from Planned Parenthood, that I know that all the providers in the state will take every step necessary, regardless of how unnecessary and how burdensome it is, to ensure that access to abortion still remains. It is important to know that all the drugs related to a medication abortion are already treated as narcotics here in Oklahoma. So providers have very strict regulations already around it. So, and they are heavily, no surprise, heavily regulated, and surprise inspections, and Department of Health has to come in. So I say that not to diminish this, how burdensome this bill is. I definitely think it's just a matter of, we are very sure that providers in Oklahoma will go the extra mile to ensure that care happens, despite what Senate Bill 779 does. I do think it's very interesting that in committee yesterday, while many of us were asking people to reach out and vote, have members vote no on this bill, it was actually the board, the pharmacy board, that had some of the biggest reaction to this bill, because it puts a lot of regulations on them. So in an attempt to restrict access, they are causing more issues with the people with the agency that would be required to follow it, not necessarily more restrictions on doctors dispensing. I'm gonna give it, I think those are all the questions we have, and want to be also respectful of people's time. I want to pass this over to Lisa real quick, our development director, just to give her an opportunity to tell you about some of the great things that are going on in her work. And Lisa, I'll let you have it.
Thank you so much. Well, as you can see, everyone that's here tonight, there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done. We sum it up by saying this session, we're asking the legislature to stick to the principle of no new fines and no new crimes. And so if you think about that, think of all the work ahead of us, and just know that the only way that we can do this work is with your support. As a nonprofit organization, the funding that we receive from you through your membership, through your gifts to the foundation, truly is the only way that Nicole and the other incredible staff members, this small but mighty staff, as I like to say, are going to be able to do the work this legislative session. So what I've dropped in the chat is a link to find out ways to give to the ACLU, both through membership and through gifts to the foundation. My email is there. I would love for you to reach out at any time with any questions about giving to the ACLU and how that works. We also have a link. I think Cassidy is going to drop, or he has already dropped, a link to our impact report. This is a tremendous overview of the incredible work that's been done over the last year. It also includes an overview of this current legislative session. So it's a terrific look back, and then certainly a look at what's ahead for us over the next few months. So with that, again, we thank you so much for your time. We thank you for your support and for your interest in our work. Please reach out at any time, visit our website. That impact report will be there as well, and other information on the ongoing legal work that we have, and of course the work that Nicole is closely monitoring, and then of course the terrific work of Tamaya as well, and everyone else. So thank you all again so much. We really appreciate you being here tonight.
Have a good night.